The air in the Hawthorne Grand Manor's ballroom was thick with the scent of 1,000 white roses and the quiet hum of anticipation. Crystal chandeliers dripped light onto tables laden with silver and porcelain, and 200 guests, draped in their finest silks and tailored suits, waited. At the head of the room, on a small elevated dais, stood Mark Thompson, his smile a little too tight, his eyes fixed on the grand oak doors at the far end of the aisle. He looked the part of the perfect groom, impeccably dressed, handsome, the heir to the Thompson real estate empire. But beneath the starched collar of his shirt, a bead of sweat traced a path down his spine. He was marrying Jessica Vance, and today, like every day with Jessica, had to be perfect. The doors swung open. A collective gasp, soft and appreciative, rippled through the room. There she was. Jessica was not merely a bride, she was a spectacle. Her dress, a custom-designed Vera Wang masterpiece, was a cascade of ivory silk and hand-stitched pearls that reportedly cost more than the average family car. It clung to her slender frame before fanning out into a cathedral train that seemed to swallow the light. Her face, framed by a veil of gossamer silk, was a mask of serene, almost regal beauty. But as she began her slow, measured walk down the aisle on her father's arm, her eyes weren't on Mark. They were scanning the room, checking every detail: the floral arrangements, the posture of the guests, the angle of the sunlight slanting through the stained glass windows. She was not a woman walking towards her future. She was a queen inspecting her domain. Mark's father, David Thompson, sat in the front pew. He was a man carved from granite and quiet dignity, his silver hair a stark contrast to his dark, bespoke suit. He watched Jessica's procession not with the teary-eyed pride of a father-in-law, but with a still, unreadable expression. He saw the way her lips thinned almost imperceptibly as she passed a floral arrangement that was perhaps an inch out of place. He saw the cold assessment in her gaze. He had harbored doubts about this union for months, quiet concerns he'd voiced to Mark, only to be met with defensive assurances. "You don't know her like I do, Dad," Mark had said. "She just wants things to be right." David watched his son, whose smile now seemed genuine as his bride approached, and a familiar ache settled in his chest. It was the ache of a father watching his son mistake brittleness for strength. The ceremony was flawless, a testament to Jessica's meticulous, iron-fisted planning. Her vows were eloquent, Mark's were heartfelt, and the kiss was cinematic. The crowd erupted in applause, and as the couple turned to walk back down the aisle, Jessica's smile was finally dazzlingly real. It was the smile of victory. The reception that followed was even more opulent. Champagne flowed from fountains, a string quartet played Vivaldi, and a tower of exquisitely decorated macarons stood like a monument to excess. Jessica held court, gliding from table to table, accepting compliments with a graciousness that felt rehearsed. It was during the main course, a delicate pan-seared sea bass with a saffron risotto, that the first crack appeared in the perfect facade. A young waitress named Clara Evans, her face flushed with a mixture of nerves and heat from the kitchen, was carefully navigating the crowded space between tables. She was a student at the local community college, and this high-paying catering gig was the only thing keeping her from falling behind on rent. She moved with practiced care, her tray held high and steady. But as she approached the head table, Jessica's 6-year-old cousin, bored and petulant, suddenly darted out from under a tablecloth, chasing a stray ribbon. Clara had no time to react. The boy collided with her legs, her body jolted, and the tray tilted. A single full glass of red wine, a deep blood-red Merlot, arced through the air in a horrifyingly slow-motion ballet. It seemed to hang there for an eternity before landing with a soft, sickening splash directly onto the pristine ivory lap of Jessica's Vera Wang dress. A collective, horrified gasp sucked the air from the room. The music screeched to a halt as the quartet faltered. Every eye was fixed on the head table, where a dark spider-webbing stain was rapidly spreading across the priceless silk. Clara stood frozen, her face as white as the tablecloths. The empty tray clattered from her numb fingers onto the floor. I'm so sorry," she whispered, the words catching in her throat. "I am so sorry." Jessica looked down at the stain. For a moment she didn't move, her face a blank canvas. Then her head snapped up, her blue eyes, once serene, now blazing with a cold, terrifying fury. She rose slowly from her chair, her body trembling not with sorrow, but with incandescent rage. "You," she hissed, her voice low and venomous, "you clumsy, incompetent little fool. Do you have any idea what you've done?" "It was an accident," Clara stammered, tears welling in her eyes. "Your cousin, he ran into me. Do not blame a child for your own uselessness," Jessica shrieked, her voice echoing in the cavernous, silent hall. She took a step forward, closing the space between them. Mark, finally snapping out of his stupor, started to rise. "Jessica, honey, let's just—" But he was too late. With a movement as swift and vicious as a striking snake, Jessica drew back her hand and slapped Clara across the face. The sound was sharp and ugly, a crack that seemed to shatter the crystal and silence in the room. Clara stumbled back, her hand flying to her cheek, a bright red handprint already blooming on her pale skin. A single tear escaped and traced a path through the burgeoning mark. The bride, in her ruined gown, stood over the weeping waitress, her chest heaving, her beautiful face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated contempt. And in the front row, David Thompson, who had seen the entire thing, the boy, the stumble, the slap, slowly, deliberately rose to his feet. The silence that followed the slap was absolute and profound. It was heavier than the crystal chandeliers, more oppressive than the summer humidity outside. 200 pairs of eyes were locked on the tableau at the head table. The furious bride, the cowering waitress, and the stunned groom frozen halfway out of his chair. Clara's quiet, choked sobs were the only sound that dared to disturb the stillness. Jessica's parents, Richard and Eleanor Vance, were already rushing forward, their faces a mixture of concern for their daughter and annoyance at the disruption. "Oh, Jessica, darling, your dress," Eleanor cried, her voice laced with theatrical despair. Richard Vance glared at the terrified waitress. "Someone get this girl out of here, and get her name. Our planner will be in touch with her employer about the damages." He spoke with the casual authority of a man who solved all his problems with money and threats. But before anyone else could move or speak, another voice cut through the tension. It was not loud, but it carried a weight that made everyone turn. "Stop." It was David Thompson. He had risen from his seat and was now standing in the aisle, his face set like stone. His gaze was not on his son or the Vances, but fixed directly on Jessica. There was no anger in his eyes, only a deep, chilling disappointment that was far more damning. Jessica, still breathing heavily, turned to him, her expression shifting from rage to indignant disbelief. "David, this has nothing to do with you. This idiot ruined my wedding." David took a slow, deliberate step forward. He completely ignored Jessica and her parents. His eyes found the weeping girl, Clara, who was now being helped to her feet by a sympathetic-looking banquet captain. David's gaze softened for a fraction of a second as he looked at her, a flicker of something that looked like pained recognition. Then he turned his attention back to the room, his voice calm but resonating with an unshakable finality. "Stop this wedding," he said. The words hung in the air, electric and unbelievable. A confused murmur rippled through the guests. Mark finally found his voice, his face pale with shock. "Dad, what are you talking about? We're already married. The ceremony is over." "I'm not talking about the ceremony, Mark," David said, his eyes now locking onto his son's. "I'm talking about this spectacle, this celebration of cruelty. I will not be a part of it. I will not lend my name, my presence, or my blessing to it for one more second." Richard Vance stepped forward, his face purpling with anger. "Now see here, David, my daughter is the victim. Her day has been ruined by incompetence. An apology is owed to her." David's gaze shifted to Richard, and it was like watching a glacier move, slow, cold, and unstoppable. "Your daughter just assaulted a member of the staff in front of 200 people because of an accident involving a child. She felt no shame, no remorse, only rage. If that is the woman my son has married, then he has made a catastrophic mistake. And this party," he said, gesturing around the opulent, now silent ballroom, "is over." Jessica let out a sound that was half scoff, half sob. "You can't do that. This is my wedding. You are a guest here." "This wedding," David said, his voice dropping to a low, steely tone, was paid for in its entirety by me. This venue, the caterers, the 1,000 white roses, that dress you're wearing, all of it. And as the host, I am shutting it down. Now." He turned to the banquet captain, who was hovering nearby, looking utterly bewildered. "Sir, please begin clearing the room. Inform the guests that the reception has concluded. My apologies for the inconvenience. The staff will be compensated in full for their time, with a significant bonus for their trouble." He then looked pointedly at Clara, who was watching him with wide, tear-filled eyes. "Especially this young lady." The captain, seeing the iron certainty in David's face and knowing exactly who was signing his check, simply nodded. "Yes, Mr. Thompson." Panic began to set in on Jessica's face, replacing the rage. This was not how the script was supposed to go. She was the princess, the star. She was supposed to be adored, placated, and catered to. She turned to her husband, her voice suddenly taking on a pleading, childish whine. "Mark, do something. He can't do this. It's our day." Mark stood trapped between the two most powerful forces in his life. His new wife, whose temper he knew and feared, and his father, whose quiet authority he had never once seen waver. The guests were beginning to stir, whispering amongst themselves, their faces a mixture of shock, pity, and a kind of morbid excitement. They were witnessing the social event of the year implode in the most spectacular fashion imaginable. "Dad, please," Mark stammered, running a hand through his perfectly coiffed hair. "Let's just go to a private room. We can talk about this. Don't do this in front of everyone." David considered his son for a long moment. "A private room? Fine. The Vances, you, me, and Jessica." He then added one more condition, his voice leaving no room for argument. "But first, she is going to find that young woman, and she is going to apologize. A real, sincere apology. In front of everyone she just humiliated her in front of. That is my non-negotiable starting point." Jessica's head snapped back as if she'd been slapped herself. "Apologize? To her? Absolutely not. She should be apologizing to me. She should be on her knees begging for my forgiveness." David Thompson simply looked at his son. He didn't need to say another word. The ultimatum was clear. The choice was Mark's. He could stand with his wife and her unyielding, cruel pride, or he could stand with his father and the simple human decency he was demanding. The magnificent ballroom, once a symbol of a perfect union, had become a battleground, and Mark was standing directly in the crossfire. In a small, windowless office tucked away behind the bustling kitchen, the air was thick with the smell of starched linen and stale coffee. This was where David had insisted they convene, away from the prying eyes and escalating whispers of the departing guests. The room was cramped. David stood by the door, his arms crossed, a silent, immovable sentinel. Richard and Eleanor Vance sat stiffly on a worn love seat, their faces masks of outrage, and Jessica paced the small patch of available carpet like a caged tigress, the wine stain on her dress a dark, ugly blotch on her fury. Mark stood awkwardly in the center of the room, feeling the walls close in on him. "This is an outrage, David, a complete and utter outrage," Richard Vance began, his voice a low growl. "You have embarrassed my family. You have humiliated my daughter on what was supposed to be the happiest day of her life." "Your daughter humiliated herself, Richard," David replied, his voice level, "and she humiliated a young woman who was just trying to do her job. There's a difference. She ruined a $50,000 dress," Eleanor shrieked, her voice thin and reedy. "That girl should be arrested. We should sue her." David's gaze didn't waver. "It's a dress, Eleanor. It's a piece of fabric. You're more concerned about a material object than the fact that your daughter physically assaulted another human being." "Oh, please, it was just a little slap," Jessica spat, whirling to face him. "She deserved it. She was clumsy and stupid, and she ruined everything." "She was bumped by your cousin," David stated flatly. "I saw it. Several people saw it. It was an accident that was not her fault." This information seemed to make Jessica even more furious. The idea that she might be in the wrong was not something her mind could easily process. "I don't care. She should have been more careful. People like her, they're paid to be invisible, to not make mistakes. That's their only purpose." The venom in her voice, the casual dismissive cruelty of "people like her," landed in the small room with a thud. Mark flinched. He had heard tones like this from her before, in private moments. A snide remark about a slow cashier, a condescending comment to a valet. But he had always brushed it off, telling himself she was just stressed or a perfectionist. Hearing it now, laid bare in the harsh fluorescent light of this back office, it sounded different. It sounded ugly. David's expression hardened. A shadow passed over his features, a memory surfacing with painful clarity. He uncrossed his arms and took a step forward, his voice dropping so low it was almost a whisper. "People like her," he repeated, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "Let me tell you about people like her, Jessica." He turned his eyes to his son. "Mark, you were young when your mother died. You remember her as the woman who ran charity galas and sat on the board of the museum. You remember the comfortable life she had after we became successful." Mark nodded, confused. "Of course. What does Mum have to do with this?" "Before I had a dime to my name," David continued, his gaze distant, "before Thompson Realty was anything more than a dream I was running out of a one-room office, your mother, Catherine, worked 2 jobs to keep us afloat. During the day, she was a secretary. At night, 4 times a week, she put on a black and white uniform, not so different from the one that girl is wearing, and she waited tables at a steakhouse downtown. She carried heavy trays, she cleaned up spilled drinks, and she dealt with rude, entitled customers who looked down on her, who treated her like she was invisible, like her only purpose was to serve them." The room fell silent. Jessica stopped pacing. This was a chapter of the Thompson family history she had never been told. It didn't fit with the narrative of old money and effortless success she had married into. "I remember one night," David's voice was thick with emotion now. "She came home long after midnight, her feet swollen, and she just sat down at our small kitchen table and cried. She cried because a man, celebrating some big business deal, had snapped his fingers at her all night. And when she was a moment too slow refilling his wine, he'd called her a stupid cow and told her she was lucky to even have a job. She never told me who it was. She just absorbed the humiliation because we needed the money for rent. She endured that lack of dignity so that you and I could have a future. So that one day her son could stand in a grand ballroom and marry a woman in a $50,000 dress." He finally looked directly at Jessica, and his eyes were filled with a fire she had never seen. "That waitress out there, Clara. She is your mother, Mark. She is my Catherine. She is every person who works hard for too little money, who puts up with disrespect just to make ends meet, who deserves to be treated with basic human decency. And you," he said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper as he addressed Jessica, "you stood there in a dress paid for by my wife's hard work and sacrifice, and you treated that girl with the exact same contempt that broke your mother's heart 30 years ago. You didn't just slap a waitress, Jessica. You slapped the memory of Catherine Thompson." A heavy, suffocating silence descended. Eleanor and Richard Vance looked stunned, their arguments about a ruined dress suddenly seeming petty and obscene. Mark stared at his father, seeing not just the powerful businessman, but a grieving husband fiercely defending his late wife's honor. He looked at Jessica, who for the first time seemed at a loss for words, her face pale. "So no," David said, his voice regaining its steel, "I will not overlook this. I will not smooth this over. There is only one way forward." Just then, the door opened and the banquet captain, George, escorted a trembling Clara Evans into the room. Her presence made the tension unbearable. David nodded to her, a gesture of respect. Before continuing, his eyes locked on Jessica. "You will apologize to Miss Evans, a genuine, truthful apology. Right here, right now. Or so help me God, Mark, this marriage is not the only thing that ends today." The threat was unspoken but crystal clear. Mark knew his father. This wasn't a bluff. His position at the company, his inheritance, his entire future as a Thompson was hanging in the balance. Jessica looked from David's unyielding face to Clara's, her lip curling in a sneer of pure revulsion. The idea of apologizing to this, nobody was more humiliating than the wine stain. Eleanor nudged her daughter, a silent, frantic plea to just play along. Jessica took a sharp breath, her eyes glittering with malice. "Fine," she spat, the word dripping with sarcasm. She turned to Clara, not even looking at her face, but at a spot on the wall just above her head. "I'm sorry. that you were so clumsy and that this whole unpleasantness had to happen. Before David could speak, Clara's own voice, though quiet, cut through the room. No. All eyes turned to her. She stood a little straighter, her hand no longer covering the red mark on her cheek. No, ma'am. That's not an apology. That's just another way of calling me clumsy. I won't accept it. Jessica's jaw dropped. The audacity of the hired help refusing her forced magnanimity was beyond comprehension. How dare you? She dares because she has more integrity in her little finger than you have in your entire body, Jessica, David said, his voice like ice. That was not an apology. It was an insult. Try again. Admit the truth. Admit it was not her fault, and that you lost your temper and behaved like a monster. I will not, Jessica shrieked, her composure shattering completely. She is nothing, a smudge on a perfect day. Why are you defending her? Daddy, make him stop. Richard Vance stood up, his face a mask of blustering authority. David, the girl has her apology. You've made your point. This is over. You're right, Richard. It is over, David said, his voice chillingly calm. But not in the way you think. The word test had hung in the air moments before, and Mark finally understood. His father wasn't just angry, he was conducting an experiment. He had held up a mirror to Jessica's soul, and the reflection was ugly and cruel. He saw the beautiful face he had fallen for, now twisted with a rage that was terrifying in its intensity. He heard the forced, venomous apology that held not a shred of remorse. He remembered her words, people like her, and the echo of his father's story about his mother. He had willfully ignored every red flag, every moment of cold, hard selfishness, convincing himself it was strength. But it wasn't strength, it was a void. With a clarity that was both terrifying and liberating, Mark knew what he had to do. He stepped forward, positioning himself between Jessica and Clara. He turned to his wife, his eyes filled with a profound and weary sadness. It's not enough, Jess, he said, his voice quiet but firm. Jessica stared at him, bewildered. Mark, what are you talking about? Are you siding with them? There are no sides, Mark replied, shaking his head. There's just right and wrong, and what you did was wrong. He took a deep breath, the next words feeling heavy and irreversible. I remember when you told the valet at the club he had stupid hands because he took a moment too long with the keys. I remember when you mocked your friend Sarah's engagement ring behind her back because it wasn't big enough. I told myself it was just your high standards. It wasn't. It was poison. My father is right. This isn't a marriage. It's a transaction, and I've been paying way too high a price. He reached up and began to unfasten the white rose pinned to his lapel. We're done, Jessica. The words dropped into the silence like stones into a deep well. Eleanor gasped. Richard's jaw dropped. Jessica's face went from rage to utter disbelief. What did you just say to me? She whispered, her voice a venomous hiss. I said we're done, Mark repeated, his voice stronger now, the fog of his infatuation finally lifting. He dropped the rose onto a small side table. It landed with a soft final thud. The wedding is off. The marriage is over. For a moment, Jessica just stared, her mind refusing to process the words. Then the mask of indignation shattered, replaced by a primal fury. With a guttural scream, she lunged not at the door, but at Mark, her manicured nails aiming for his face. You will not do this to me. I will ruin you. You are nothing without me. Mark stumbled back, shocked, but David moved with a speed that belied his age, stepping between them and catching Jessica's wrists in an iron grip. That's enough, he boomed, his voice echoing in the tiny room. Richard Vance surged forward. Get your hands off my daughter, David. Control your child, Richard, or I'll have her charged with assault. A charge that I'm sure Miss Evans here would be happy to corroborate, David said, nodding towards Clara, who stood frozen in horror. He released Jessica, who stumbled back into her father's arms, sobbing with rage and frustration. David straightened his suit jacket, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to the Vance's hysteria. You talk about being ruined, he said, his gaze falling on Richard, cold and analytical. Let's talk about being ruined, shall we? You seem to think this marriage was a merger of equals. It wasn't. It was a lifeline, a bailout. Richard's face went from purple to a pasty white. I don't know what you're talking about. That's slander. Is it? David's voice was laced with contempt. Did you really think I'd let my son merge our family's assets with Vance Construction without doing my due diligence? I've had my forensic accountants going over your books for the last 3 months. I know about the falsified profit reports. I know about the 2 failed developments you leveraged the company against. I know you're 3 weeks from insolvency. He let the words sink in. This wedding, this $50,000 dress, this entire spectacle. It was all a desperate, last-ditch gamble to get your hands on Thompson money before your entire house of cards collapsed. The heir left the room. Eleanor Vance looked at her husband, her mouth agape. Jessica's sobs hitched in her throat as she stared at her father, a new dawning horror in her eyes. You're bluffing, Richard stammered, but his eyes darted around the room like a cornered animal. Am I? David asked softly. He turned to the banquet captain. George, would you be so kind? George, who had remained silently by the door, reached into his own jacket pocket. He wasn't just a captain, he was David's head of security, a man who had been with him for 30 years. He produced a small, professional-grade audio recorder and pressed a button. Jessica's own shrill voice filled the room. She should be on her knees begging for my forgiveness. Followed by Richard's voice. Our planner will be in touch with her employer about the damages. And Eleanor's. That girl should be arrested. We should sue her. It was all there. The threats, the rage, the utter lack of remorse, culminating in Jessica's shrieked assault on Mark. David let it play for a few agonizing seconds before George switched it off. I suspected this union might end in disaster, David said. I just didn't realize it would be so theatrical. I took precautions. But there's one more thing you should know. He turned his gaze to Clara, whose face was stained with tears, but whose eyes now held a quiet strength. Miss Evans, I believe you know the name Catherine, David said gently. Clara's eyes widened. She nodded slowly. It was my grandmother's name. Catherine Evans. She passed away a few years ago. David's expression softened with a profound sadness. Your grandmother and my wife, Catherine Thompson, worked together at the old downtown steakhouse for nearly 5 years. They were friends. My Catherine spoke of your grandmother often, how kind she was, how she helped her through the toughest shifts. When I first saw your name on the staff list for tonight, a list I specifically requested, I wondered if there was a connection. Seeing you tonight, you have her eyes. You have her dignity. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. The pained recognition, the fierce defense. This wasn't just about a random waitress, it was about honoring a legacy. It was personal. David walked to the door and opened it. The grand ballroom was not empty. A select group of about a dozen guests remained, clustered near the exit, their departure clearly delayed. David's voice, now amplified by the ballroom's acoustics, was clear and cold as he stepped into the archway. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. I asked a few of you to remain for a special announcement. He gestured into the room, inviting the Vances into the spotlight they so desperately craved, though not in the way they had ever imagined. Among the lingering guests were Beatrice Fairfax, the city's most feared society columnist, whose phone was already poised, a shark smile playing on her lips. Don't stop on my account, David, she purred, her voice carrying across the marble floor. The city is dying to know how this fairy tale ends. Beside her stood the Harrington brothers, corporate raiders known for their merciless takeovers, and a grim-faced man named Sterling, the vice president of the bank that held all of Vance Construction's debt. This was not an audience, it was a firing squad. Beatrice, you may want to record this, David said, his eyes glinting. Effective immediately, the proposed merger between Thompson Realty and Vance Construction is cancelled. He paused, letting the statement land, then turned his gaze on Richard Vance, who had stumbled out of the office behind him, his face the color of ash. The cancellation is due to the discovery of catastrophic financial mismanagement and, I'm afraid, compelling evidence of criminal fraud on the part of Mr. Vance. A collective, sharp intake of breath rippled through the small crowd. Beatrice's thumbs were a blur across her screen, her smile widening. The banker, Sterling, took a slow, menacing step forward, a vein throbbing in his temple. His eyes, fixed on Richard, were chips of ice. "Fraud, David." Sterling's voice was like grinding stone. "Richard, you assured me your quarterly reports were sound when you applied to restructure your debt last month. You used this wedding, this merger, as proof of your impending solvency." He pointed a finger that trembled with rage at Richard, his face a mask of cold fury. "Fraud isn't just a breach of contract, it's a crime. Your house, Richard, your cars, your wife's jewelry, you personally guaranteed that debt against everything. You didn't just bet your company, you bet your life, and you lost. My legal team will be in touch with the district attorney's office on Monday. Consider all your lines of credit frozen. We will be discussing liquidation." "Tough break, Richie," one of the Harrington brothers drawled, a predatory grin spreading across his face. He nudged his brother, who chuckled softly. "But don't you worry. When Sterling puts your assets on the auction block, we'll be there. We'll give you 10 cents on the dollar for your heavy equipment. It's the least we can do for an old friend." The Vances stood trapped in a cage of their own making, their public execution broadcast to the most influential people in their world. But David wasn't finished. "And as for the wedding," he continued, his voice resonating with a final damning authority, "it has been annulled. My son has come to realize that a person's true worth is not measured by their beauty or their wealth, but by their character, by how they treat those they perceive to be beneath them." Mark stepped out of the office then, moving to his father's side, his back straight, his eyes clear. He looked at the stunned faces, his gaze finally settling on Jessica, who was peering out from the doorway, her face a grotesque mask of tears and ruined makeup. "I was a fool, Jessica," Mark said, his voice steady, all traces of his earlier uncertainty gone. "I was so dazzled by the performance, by the image you projected, that I refused to see the person underneath." He slowly, deliberately twisted the heavy platinum wedding band from his finger. The metal seemed to burn his skin. "I don't want this. I don't want a life built on a foundation of fear and contempt." He walked to the head table, a scene of chaos and ruin, and placed the ring beside the fallen Macaron Tower. This was all a performance, and the show is over. David's eyes found Clara, who was still standing hesitantly in the office doorway, a silent witness to the implosion. "Miss Evans, would you come here, please?" Trembling, Clara stepped into the ballroom. David addressed her in front of everyone, his voice softening with respect. "On behalf of my family, and in memory of my wife Catherine and your grandmother Catherine, I want to offer you our deepest, most sincere apology for the humiliation and assault you suffered tonight. It was despicable and unforgivable." He then reached into his pocket and produced a checkbook. "I know this can't erase what happened, but my wife left behind a small trust, the Catherine Foundation, to help young people who show extraordinary character in the face of hardship. I can think of no one more deserving of its first grant." He wrote out the check with a firm hand and tore it from the book, handing it to her. Clara stared at it, her eyes widening at the number of zeros. It was for $100,000. On the memo line he'd written, "For your education, with respect." Tears streamed down Clara's face, but for the first time they weren't tears of fear or shame. They were tears of shock, of vindication. She looked up at David, her voice barely a whisper but heard by everyone in the silent room. "Thank you, Mr. Thompson. But it was never about the money." She then turned her gaze to Jessica, who was now being held up by her shell-shocked mother. Clara's expression was not one of triumph or pity, but of simple, profound truth. "I just wanted you to see me, to see that I was a person, that's all." That simple statement, more than all the financial ruin and public shaming, seemed to be the final blow. Jessica, watching from the office doorway, finally broke. The public humiliation, the loss of Mark, the exposure of her family's ruin, the revelation that the girl she'd brutalized was linked to the very history of the family she'd tried to conquer. It was too much. She let out a final, pathetic wail, a sound of pure animal despair, and collapsed to the floor, clawing at the stained silk of her dress as if it were on fire. "No, it was my day. It was perfect. It was mine," she screamed, her voice cracking as she devolved into a sobbing, thrashing heap. Her perfect day, her perfect life, had not just cracked. It had been systematically dismantled and utterly destroyed by the very arrogance that had fueled it. Her karma had arrived, not with a whisper, but with a thunderous public crash. Richard Vance, his face ashen, made one last desperate appeal. "David, please. We can fix this." George, the head of security, stepped smoothly in front of him. "I think it's time for you and your family to leave, Mr. Vance," he said, his tone polite but his eyes like chips of flint. He gestured to two other security men who had materialized by the main doors. There would be no more scenes. As the Vances were escorted out like common trespassers, Eleanor trying to haul her shrieking daughter from the floor, their hushed, frantic arguments were swallowed by the night. The last of the guests melted away, Beatrice Fairfax last among them, a triumphant final tap on her phone before she disappeared. Soon the vast ballroom was empty, save for three people standing amidst the wreckage of the celebration: David, Mark, and Clara. The silence was vast, broken only by the soft hum of the chandeliers that still dripped light onto the abandoned feast. Mark walked over to Clara, his face etched with shame. "Miss Evans." "Clara, there's nothing I can say to undo what happened. I wasn't just blind. I was a coward. I stood by and let it happen because your life was inconvenient and her life was easy. I have to live with that. I am so deeply sorry." Clara looked from the check in her hand to the young man in front of her. She saw the genuine remorse in his eyes, the painful honesty of a man waking from a long dream. She gave a small, hesitant nod. "Your father, he said I have my grandmother's dignity. She always taught me that dignity is all you really have when everything else is gone." David placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "That grant isn't just a gift, Clara. It's an investment. My wife would have been proud to invest in someone like you. If you'll allow it, I'd like to offer you a position at the foundation, a real one. We help people who've been overlooked, people with potential who just need a chance. We could use a person with your character at the helm." For the first time that night, a small, genuine smile touched Clara's lips. She looked around the ruined ballroom, at the toppled flowers, the stained tablecloths, the discarded wedding ring gleaming softly under the lights. It was a scene of utter disaster, the end of a dynasty and a dream. But for her, standing there between the two men who had chosen decency over decorum, it felt strangely like a beginning. David then turned to his son. The anger had left his face, replaced by a weary sadness. "Your mother would be disappointed in who you almost became, Mark. But she would be so proud of the man you chose to be in the last 10 minutes. That's the man she raised." Mark's eyes welled with tears. "I almost lost myself, Dad. I almost became one of them." He glanced at the platinum ring on the table, a symbol of a life he had so narrowly escaped. "We all make mistakes," David said, his voice softer. "The measure of a man isn't that he never falls. It's that he gets back up and learns which way to walk." He nodded towards the grand entrance. "Let's get out of here. This place smells like regret." As they walked towards the doors, Mark paused and looked back at Clara. "My father is right. This isn't a gift, it's an investment. But maybe it could also be a start. I have a lot to make up for, a lot to learn about what's real. I'd like to hear more about your grandmother someday, if you'd let me take you to a simple cup of coffee. No pretense, no performance." Clara clutched the check, a passport to a future she'd never thought possible. She looked at Mark, no longer a prince in a fairy tale, but a man humbled by his own blindness, and saw not an obligation, but a possibility. "I'd like that," she said, her voice clear and steady for the first time. Together, the three of them walked out of the ballroom, leaving the ghost of a wedding behind. On their way through the grand archway, they passed over a single white rose, fallen from a centerpiece and crushed underfoot during the exodus. They stepped into the cool night air, away from the scent of 1,000 wilting flowers, and into a silence that was not empty, but full of promise. Like, share, and comment your thoughts on this ending,